Welcome to the Changes in the Temple Recommend Questions 1856 to 2022 video. Okay, short scripture here from the Doctrine and Covenants, section 109, verse 20, a Mormon scripture. No unclean thing shall be permitted to come into thy house, which is the temple, to pollute it. No unclean thing is allowed. Okay, statement from the Apostle John Taylor in 1844. One of the earliest statements we have about who is worthy to go to the temple, who is clean. And it's no surprise that one of the first things that leaders of the church talked about was tithing. The leaders have always been big on tithing. A man who has not paid his tithing is unfit to be baptized for his dead. So to do baptisms for the dead, you need to pay your tithing. But this was before the formal recommend questions were put in place, though. All right, another statement here saying basically the same thing. This is in a book by N.B. Lundwall, Temples of the Most High in 1956. This may certify, and he's talking about a Nauvoo certificate, that George B. Gardner is entitled to the privilege of the baptismal font in the temple, I guess for baptisms of the dead, having paid his tithing in full up until October 12th, 1845. So since he paid his tithing, he's entitled to the baptismal font in the temple. All right, moving on to the year 1853. This video is going to be in chronological order, as are a lot of my videos. But it's interesting to note that people used to get their endowments at much younger ages than they do now. So I just throw these in for just from some general information. This can be found in Joseph Fielding Smith's book, Doctrines of Salvation, 1955, Volume 2. Around 1853, Joseph F. Smith was endowed at age 15. He's the one that went on to become the apostle and the prophet. He was endowed at age 15, so pretty young. All right, one of the main sources for this video, probably the main source, is an article in the Journal of Mormon History by Edward L. Kimball. It's entitled The History of LDS Temple Admission Standards, basically how these temple recommend questions have changed over time. This article came out in 1998. I filled in more of the gaps and included a lot of other material as well that is not in this article. But Kimball says before 1856, there were no standard interviews for temple recommends. So that's interesting. The temple recommend questions started in 1856. Okay, some first presidency instructions, I guess, regarding the temple. In 1856, March of 1856, you can find this information in David J. Berger's book, Mysteries of Godliness. In March of 1856, candidates for the endowment must be those who pray, who pay their tithing from year to year, who live the lives of saints from day to day. So again, tithing important and prayer important. I don't think prayer is in those questions anymore, though. Okay, same source here. Says that boys and girls should be over the age of 16, which seems to me to be very young to be making these very serious eternal covenants with God. They should set a good example before their neighbors in order to go to the temple. Men and women, boys and girls over 16 years of age who are living the lives of saints. So that's a requirement, I guess, here early on in 1856. All right, and here is a very interesting statement. Same source here. First Presidency Instructions in the Parowan Historical Record, 1856. It said that candidates for the temple endowment should believe in the plurality. What's the plurality? Well, that's just polygamy. So it's very interesting here. Early on, 1856, in order to go to the temple, you needed to believe in polygamy. And you do not speak evil of the authorities of the church. That's always been important in the church. Don't speak evil of the Lord's anointed. You can get excommunicated for that. Candidates should possess true integrity towards their friends. Okay, moving on to another source. This is from the Apostle and in the First Presidency, Heber C. Kimball, Instructions to Bishops, in the Journal History of the Church, May 19, 1856. I'd like to get a copy of that. It's a big journal history that I think you can go look at it in the church archives. I wonder if they'd let me go in there. Endowment candidates must pay their tithing from year to year. So again, that's important. Pay, pray, and obey, right? They must pray in their families, which I don't think that's in there anymore. They should not speak against the authorities of the church and the kingdom of God, right? That's apostasy. You don't speak evil of the Lord's anointed. Okay, same source here, Heber C. Kimball. Candidates should not steal, nor lie, nor interfere with their neighbors' things, nor their neighbors' wives or husbands. So don't steal or lie. That has to do with honesty, right? There's still questions in there relating to honesty nowadays. Don't interfere with your neighbor's things. I don't know what that means. Don't interfere with neighbors' wives. Well, that's something that Joseph Smith did, right, with polyandry. He married other men's wives. I think you could say that that's interfering with neighbors' wives. So in 1856, maybe Joseph Smith wouldn't be admitted to the temple. Okay, same source here, Apostle and in the First Presidency, Heber C. Kimball at this time. Candidates should attend strictly to their meetings and prayer meetings. I think that's still in there. Pay due respect to their presiding officers and do not swear. That's not in the questions anymore. So I guess you can swear. Okay, Heber C. Kimball continues here. We shall expect you to pick up the old and infirm, the lame, the halt, and the blind, and the righteous poor, but not the devil's poor. Not sure what the devil's poor is. I'd have to look into that. So, kind of the things that Jesus Christ taught in the New Testament. Pick up the old and infirm, help the lame and the blind and the poor, etc. So these are good things, I think, but they're not in the temple recommend questions anymore. Okay, Kimball continues. We would like to see many sprightly young persons who are strict to obey their parents. This is what they like to see coming into the temple. Kimball likes that word sprightly. He said that practicing polygamy makes you sprightly in your step or something like that. There's a quote from him. But the candidates should strictly obey their parents. That's not in there anymore. He also says candidates should bathe beforehand. That kind of goes without saying, right? I'm sure they're a lot more dirty at this time, though. So, yeah, make sure you bathe before you go to the temple. In Ephesians 6, it says obey your parents. All right, moving on to another source. This is a book by Claude Richards, J. Golden Kimball, 1934. About 1866, J. Golden Kimball, Heber C. Kimball's son, had his endowment performed at the age of 13, very young. I don't think that's old enough to consent. I don't think it's really the age of reason to be making these eternal covenants with God. I think that's way too young. Nowadays, the guys get their endowments when they're 18, when they go on their mission. Women, if they go on a mission when they're 19, or usually in their 20s when they get married is when they get their endowments. Heber C. Kimball believed that the youth should receive their endowments when they're in their youth. That's certainly changed a lot now. 18 is quite a bit older than 13. J. Golden Kimball was known for his swearing in his speeches. He used words like hell and damn and maybe some other things, which Mormons think is pretty funny. J. Golden Kimball is pictured above. Okay, Journal History of the Church again, January 31st, 1868. In December of 1866, Brigham Young advised women not to come for the endowment for a week after beginning to menstruate. So if you're on your period, I guess, you're menstruating, you can't go to the temple until a week later, I guess. I guess the women are unclean. I don't know what he's thinking here. Yeah, certainly don't have to do that anymore. Okay, Brigham Young also counseled couples to avoid intercourse for several days before getting their endowment. That's strange. I guess it'd also be considered unclean, right? This is probably stuff found in the Bible, Old Testament kind of stuff. Avoid intercourse for several days before getting your endowment. Of course, that doesn't happen anymore, I don't believe. Okay, a statement from the Apostle Wilford Woodruff in his journal, Volume 6, December 26, 1866. He says that President Brigham Young said that when persons came to get their endowments, they should be clean and pure, kind of what we were talking about. A man should not touch a woman for 10 days before getting their endowments. In other words, sex, I guess, petting, sexual touching. A man should not touch a woman for 10 days before getting their endowments. Of course, that doesn't happen anymore. Okay, some information in Terrell Given's book, Feeding the Flock, 2017. In 1873, the prophet Brigham Young directed that only those who were certified as being tithe payers receive temple recommends. So yeah, this was very early on that you needed to pay your tithing to go to the temple. Okay, same book here, Feeding the Flock. In 1873, the prophet Brigham Young indicated that temple recommends should be predicated on an individual's worthiness with respect to honesty, that's still in there, industriousness, not in there anymore, and abstinence from alcohol, that is in there nowadays. Okay, another source here. Instructions recorded on June 14, 1881 in Ephraim, Utah by Chester Ward. Sanpete Stake donation record. You can look at the years here and this full source. Recommend questions. Is the brother ordained an elder? I guess he needed to be an elder. Is he a tithe payer in full? And is he a temple donor? I guess donating money to build these temples. All right, same source here. This is June 14, 1881. Has he been rebaptized? I guess that was a requirement to go to the temple. Is he living in full faith and fellowship with the saints of the ward? Living in full faith and fellowship with the saints. But this interesting thing, this rebaptism in the early days of the church, this is in 1881. People were rebaptized. Definitely doesn't happen anymore, right? Okay, statement from the apostle and president of the 12, Wilford Woodruff. This can be found in Merle H. Graffham's Salt Lake School of the Prophet's Minute Book, 1883. So Woodruff says, I do not believe, however, that a man should be allowed to go into the temple who does not pay tithing and drinks and curses and swears. Okay, so we have the tithing again. Drinking alcohol, I guess. That's still in these questions. And cursing and swearing. That's not in the question. So I guess maybe you can swear and still go to the temple. Probably don't want to use the F word when you're in the temple, though. Okay, another source here in the St. George, Utah Stake General Minutes, December 15, 1883. A bishop named C.A. Smith said that men who smoke and chew tobacco should not be permitted to go to the temple. This is this individual bishop making these requirements. Word of wisdom was not a commandment and a necessity to go to the temple at this time. That happened later, I believe in the 1920s, and we're going to go over that. Okay, statement from the apostle and in the first presidency, George Buchanan in 1884, Journal of Discourses. And who shall enter into the temples of our God, he asks. Repent of your sins before it is too late. And what are these sins? Drunkenness, whoremongers, and blasphemers. He says the sin is being drunk. Notice he does not say the sin is drinking alcohol. It's being drunk. Because, like I said, the word of wisdom wasn't a commandment at this time. It was a word of advice, I think he said. Can't be a whoremonger. Those are sexual sins. That's still a requirement. You can't commit blasphemy. That's not really in there anymore. And if you do, you may enter into the holy places which God has provided if you repent of these sins. Okay, statement from the first presidency here. The prophet was John Taylor. His counselors were George Buchanan and Joseph F. Smith. You can find this in the Messages of the First Presidency, Volume 3. In 1886, those entering the temple should live in harmony and peace at home. They should settle all their differences. Living in harmony and peace, and there's a similar question in there nowadays for that. Settling all differences, no, that's not in there. Pictured above is this first presidency. It's interesting to look at Joseph F. Smith on the right here when he didn't have that big long beard and he was younger. Okay, same source here, same first presidency message. The prophet again is John Taylor. In order to go to the temple, they should pray with their families morning and evening and not neglect their secret prayer. So praying with families and praying on your own as individuals. This is not a requirement anymore in the questions. Probably a lot of people are not consistent with their prayers or their scripture study. Okay, same first presidency message here. They should honestly pay their debts to all men. I guess that's being honest. And pay their tithes and offerings. They should observe the word of wisdom in the spirit and meaning thereof. Although that wouldn't get super strict, like I said, until later. Okay, same source here. It is most inconsistent to carry the smell of whiskey and tobacco into the sacred precincts of the Lord's house. That's probably a common thing going on, since the word of wisdom really wasn't a commandment at this time. So just don't carry the smell of whiskey or tobacco on you when you go into the temple. They don't say you don't drink any. Don't use any tobacco. Don't carry that smell with you when you go in. So maybe for a day or two, abstain before you go to the temple. Okay, what about members of the church that belong to secret societies? Well, in these early days, 1898 here, they did not want you to be in a secret society and disqualified those kind of people from entering the temple. I think one of the groups they're thinking about, maybe the predominant group, is the Masons. They didn't want people being Masons and Mormons at the same time. Maybe one reason is because the Mormon Temple Endowment stole so much from the Masonic ceremonies. Maybe they didn't want them seeing that. Maybe they were worried about what they're going to be doing in these secret societies. This is a first presidency letter to a stake presidency, December 16, 1907. Joseph F. Smith was the prophet at this time. But it's referring back to 1898 when the prophet Wilford Woodruff instructed the presiding priesthood in conference that members of the church members of the church who ally themselves with secret societies after having been informed of the counsel of the church against its members making such alliances disqualify themselves from entering the temple of the Lord. You belong to these secret societies, you can't go to the temple. And that therefore all such should not be recommended for temple ordinances. Of course, this is not in there anymore. At some point in the history, they changed the policy that you can be a Mason and you can be a Mormon. Okay, moving on to the Diary of Heber J. Grant in 1898 entries. Also see journal history, May 5th, 1898. On May 5th, 1898, the prophet Wilford Woodruff said that he regarded the word of wisdom in its entirety as given of the Lord for the Latter-day Saints to observe. But Woodruff did not think that bishops should withhold recommends from persons who did not adhere strictly to it. So again, they're less strict on it at this time. Bishops should not withhold recommends from persons who did not strictly adhere to the word of wisdom. All right, moving on to the diaries of Rudger Clawson, who was an apostle, April 12th, 1900 entry. In 1900, the apostles agreed that those who already belonged to secret societies should be encouraged to withdraw as soon as they reasonably can. They didn't want Mormons being Masons and involved in other secret societies. They wanted to be the secret society, right? The secret endowment, and they had the Council of 50, and we won't talk about that. Pictured above some of the regalia of the Masons. You see the square and compass jewelry there. They also wear the aprons. Some of those same symbols show up on the Salt Lake Temple, although they're remodeling it now, so they may take them off. I did a whole video on similarities between the Masonic ceremonies and the Mormon endowment. Okay, same source here, the Diaries of Apostle Rudger Clawson, April 12th, 1900 entry. The prophet Lorenzo Snow said that presidents of stakes and bishops of wards should be notified that the presidency and the 12 are opposed to secret societies and be instructed to notify the people that those who go into them, the secret societies, will be denied admission to the temple for ordinance work. Interesting. None of this is in the questions anymore. Okay, some more information about this in a circular letter, August 29, 1901. This is in the Church Historians Library. Lorenzo Snow was the prophet at this time. The Council of the First Presidency, so this is the First Presidency speaking, in all such cases has been against our brethren joining secret organizations. They're against it. And where any of them have already done so, their counsel to them, the First Presidency's counsel, is to withdraw themselves from such organizations as soon as circumstances permit and wisdom dictate. All right, same source here, 1901. All the brethren who manifest a desire to receive this advice, in other words, to withdraw from secret societies, we would give temple recommends. So in other words, if you don't withdraw, you're not going to get your temple recommend. Here's another picture of, again, the square and the compass, Masonic symbols, embroidered. Okay, 1902 Manti Temple Historical Record, again in David John Berger's book, Mysteries of Godliness. So 1902 record here. If of a naturally ripe and early development of mind and body, living children may receive endowments at the age of 12 years old. Wow, that is young. You may receive your endowment at the age of 12 years old. But as a rule, 15 years old is sufficiently early. Still way too early, in my opinion. Okay, an article here from Thomas G. Alexander, The Word of Wisdom from Principle to Requirement, in Dialogue, 1981. It says in there that in 1902, the prophet Joseph F. Smith urged his stake presidents and others to refuse recommends to flagrant violators of the word of wisdom, only flagrant violators, but to be somewhat liberal with old men who used tobacco and old ladies who drank tea, be somewhat liberal to them. Habitual drunkards, however, were to be denied temple recommends. So again, that idea, you can't be a drunkard and you can't be drunk coming to the temple. If you're an alcoholic, I guess, then you can't go to the temple. But somewhat liberal, somewhat flexible here compared to what it is now. And pictured above, we got a little old lady drinking her tea. Okay, going back to the diaries of Apostle Rudger Clawson, November 23rd, 1902 entry. And I guess he's recording the thoughts of Apostle John W. Taylor, I believe the son of John Taylor. Those who have sexual intercourse with their wives or touch any dead body are unclean until evening. This Old Testament kind of stuff. And therefore during that day should not enter the temple. Can't go to the temple if you've just had sexual intercourse with your wife that day. Can't touch any dead body. So it's kind of weird stuff. Okay, same diaries here from Rudger Clawson. A few weeks later, though, December 18, 1902 entry. He said that the prophet Joseph F. Smith further remarked that those who present themselves at the temple for blessings who appear to be unworthy, for instance, under the influence of liquor or tobacco, etc., should be put on probation. I guess this was a problem. People presenting themselves at the temple to do their endowments, their washing and anointings or whatever, but being under the influence of liquor or maybe having a smoke outside of the temple. These should be put on probation. At least you should be keeping the word of wisdom when you go to the temple, the day that you go to the temple, right? Okay, Diaries of Rudger Clawson again, but a few months later, April 7, 1903 entry. He gives an account of something that the apostle and in the first presidency, Anthon H. Lund said. And Lund said that tobacco users should not be recommended to the temple, but cases might arise where a little bit of leniency should be shown in regard to this matter. Lund pictured above. Okay, First Presidency Letter to a Stake Presidency, December 16, 1907. Joseph F. Smith, the prophet at the time here. Members of the church are not justified in allying themselves with secret societies, as by doing so they jeopardize their own faith. Maybe you start to believe in Masonry more than you do in Mormonism, right? And render themselves ineligible to receive the blessings of the house of the Lord or the temple. So if you're involved in these secret societies, you're ineligible for the blessings of the temple. And pictured above, we have, I guess, a type of a secret society in the movie Eyes Wide Shut. One of my favorites. All right, getting to our first handbook, the 1913 handbook. These are kind of like the general handbooks for the church, right? But they have the policies and temple recommend questions in them. So we're going to use these handbooks all along from here on out. 1913 handbook. A temple recommends should not be given to persons afflicted with infectious disease or with offensive skin diseases. Cannot have a temple recommended if you have an infectious disease. Maybe they didn't want other people getting the disease when you go to the temple. Or offensive skin diseases, and that's actually mentioned in Leviticus and in the Old Testament and stuff. So that may be where they're getting that idea. But this policy disappeared from future handbooks. Okay, Joseph F. Smith to C. Elmo Clough in a letter dated December 28, 1915. So in this letter in 1915, the prophet Joseph F. Smith said that young or middle-aged men who have had experience in the church should not be ordained to the priesthood, nor recommended to the privileges of the house of the Lord, in other words, the temple, unless they will abstain from the use of tobacco and intoxicating drinks. So young or middle-aged men who have had experience in the church need to start abstaining from tobacco and alcohol, I guess, intoxicating drinks. Notice he doesn't mention that for the old men, though. He gives them a break at this point. Okay, Temple Instructions to Bishops, 1918 Circular. It's from the First Presidency. Living boys and girls as young as 16 years of age may receive endowments. So, pretty young, 16. Okay, here's kind of a funny one from the Apostle and in the First Presidency, Anthon H. Lund in his diary, April 23rd, 1918 entry. So we're going along here in the chronology. We're now to 1918. A woman named Rose Fordyce lost her temple recommend because she tells fortunes by cards, maybe tarot cards, maybe some other kind of cards. She lost her temple recommend because she tells fortunes by cards. Well, this is something that the prophet Joseph Smith used to do as well. He used to tell fortunes, and if you've seen some of my other videos, you can see the documentation for that. Okay, back to that dialogue article by Thomas G. Alexander. The Word of Wisdom from Principle to Requirement, 1981 article. He says, the first time strict adherence, including abstaining from tea and coffee, was absolutely required for a temple recommend was 1921. Strict adherence to the Word of Wisdom, first a requirement in 1921. And we got the Book of Mormon musical above. This guy, looks like he has some things added to him via Photoshop, I imagine. Cigar, a beer, a Snapple. Okay, some more information from Edward L. Kimball in his book Lengthen Your Stride, 2010. He says that temple recommend questions were first formalized into a list in about 1922. Okay, also around the year 1922, a group of sexually active LDS homosexuals were barred from attending the temple. So that goes way back to 1922, banning sexually active LDS homosexuals from the temple. You can find this in D. Michael Quinn's book, Same-Sex Dynamics Among 19th Century Americans. Kind of an interesting book. Okay, 1928 Handbook of Instructions for Bishops and Counselors, Stake and Ward Clerks of the Church. So in this handbook, it says that those entering the temple are encouraged to observe the principle of tithing as well as all other gospel principles. All other gospel principles, that's pretty broad. And that part of it's not in the modern day questions. Prophet at this time was Heber J. Grant. Okay, some information I found in D. Michael Quinn's book, The Mormon Hierarchy, Extensions of Power, 1997. He says in there, on June 18, 1930, the prophet Heber J. Grant writes that he has no objection to an LDS woman receiving her temple recommend, despite her self-inflicted abortion 3 years ago. Well, that's interesting. Back in 1930, lady had an abortion 3 years ago, and Grant says she can go to the temple. I looked in the Modern Handbook. That's the way it is in the Modern Handbook today. You can have an abortion and still go to the temple. However, I think I saw in the Modern Handbook 2022 that if you've had an abortion, you cannot go on a mission. So that was kind of weird. All right, going back to Edward L. Kimball's article, The History of LDS Temple Admission Standards, and he's pictured above. He says, from about 1833 to 1933, the word of wisdom was more often taken as important advice, but not absolutely required for temple worthiness. But I guess around this time frame, 1920s, and he says 1933 is when it was absolutely required for temple worthiness. Okay, 1934 Handbook of Instructions. Candidates should sustain without reservation the general and local authorities of the church. Similar statement in the modern questions. However, this language was used only up through 1976, and then they changed the language. Prophet at this time, Heber J. Grant. Okay, same source here, the 1934 Handbook of Instructions. In 1934, the handbook instructed bishops that applicants for temple recommends should not join nor be a member of any secret oath-bound organization. Okay, the 1934 handbook also instructed bishops that those who desire to enter the temple should keep the word of wisdom. So now is when it started to get serious and a commandment. Okay, in the 1934 handbook, the standard was to observe the law of tithing, whatever observe means. Okay, also in the 1934 handbook, endowment applicants should not use profanity, and that is not a question anymore. Not sure when it was taken out. Okay, a First Presidency letter, October 17, 1938. Letter to stake presidents and mission presidents. Heber J. Grant's the president or the prophet at this time. Hereafter, you will not give a recommend under any circumstances to a wife whose husband is not a member of the church. So you cannot have a recommend for a wife whose husband is not a member of the church. Okay, same letter here from the First Presidency in 1938. You will give recommends to wives of members of the church who have not had their endowments only if the husband is absolutely willing that the endowment should be given to his wife. Okay, same letter here. You, the stake president, will therefore be expected personally to interview the husband, and he must express his willingness and consent in writing for the wife to go through and get her temple endowment. Okay, in the 1940 Handbook of Instructions, it explained that when a lodge was functionally equivalent to a religion, full involvement could be incompatible with church activity. So what kind of lodges are they talking about here that could be functionally equivalent to a religion? Probably Masonic lodges. Other dangerous organizations listed were labor unions and other fraternal lodges. So that's interesting. So that all those could be incompatible with church activity or maybe temple attendance. All right, 1940 Handbook of Instructions again. If lodge members are otherwise faithful and are exemplary in their habits, they may be accorded the privileges of the priesthood and the temple. So this is a change, right? If you used to belong to these secret organizations, you couldn't get your temple recommend. But now, in 1940, they're changing it. If lodge members are otherwise faithful and are exemplary in their habits, then they can go to the temple. They're probably talking about Masonic lodges mainly. Also, this advice appeared through 1985, so what, 45 years? But then it was just completely dropped in 1989, and they didn't refer to these lodges or secret societies in the Temple Recommend questions anymore. Okay, same source here, 1940 Handbook of Instructions. Beginning in 1940, the instructions to bishops spelled out that any church member adopting or advocating plural marriage should not be granted a temple recommend. This is the exact opposite of what it was in 1856. In 1856, it was required that you believe in the plurality. In other words, you believe in polygamy to get a temple recommend. Now you cannot adopt or advocate for plural marriage and get a temple recommend, because plural marriage was done away with the first and second manifestos, around 1910, 1915. So this statement was also included in the 1944 handbook, the 1960, the 1963, and the 1968 handbooks, but I guess was taken out after the 1968 handbooks, and none of this is mentioned anymore, although they do talk about apostate groups, which would be these groups that practice plural marriage, at least one of the groups. Okay, same handbook here in 1940. In this handbook of instructions, it says that candidates for the temple, I guess for the endowment, should show a willingness to undertake to observe the word of wisdom. What does that mean, willingness to undertake? So maybe they're not keeping it now, but in 1940 you could promise or covenant to keep the word of wisdom in the future and still get into the temple. You just had to have a willingness to undertake it. Okay, same 1940 handbook. Says something very similar about tithing as it did the word of wisdom. The 1940 handbook says that the candidate should be an honest tithe payer or undertake to become one. So you could promise or covenant to become a full tithe payer in the future and still go to the temple now in 1940. This language remained essentially the same throughout 1963, but I guess then was changed. All right, Prophet Heber J. Grant and the First Presidency in a circular letter, January 6, 1941. Great care should be taken to see that the children of apostates, as also children of parents belonging to or affiliating with apostate groups, are not given individual recommends. All right, similar language in the 1944 Handbook of Instructions regarding tithing, showing a willingness to become an honest tithe payer, and you can still get your recommend. Recommends are not to be issued to persons who are not honest tithe payers or who do not undertake to become honest tithe payers. So they kind of put the pressure on you at this time. Well, you're not honest before, you need to be honest in the future, and you can go to the temple. As distinguished from part tithe payers or token payers. All right, same 1944 Handbook of Instructions. Temple recommends are not to be issued to persons who do not observe the word of wisdom or express a willingness to undertake to observe the word of wisdom. So this is 1944 now. Of course, that's changed. You have to be keeping the word of wisdom to get in the temple now. You cannot just express a willingness to observe it in the future. All right, so one thing we didn't mention, and something that Edward Kimball doesn't mention in his article, is that African Americans or blacks could not go to the temple this whole time, this whole time period that we're talking about here, from 1856 all the way up to 1978, they could not go to the temple at all. They could not get their temple recommend and do their endowments, for the simple reason is because they're black. or they're African American. And this is an example of that. This source here, Council Minutes, August 12th, 1947. Found this in a dialogue article in 1973. The quorum upheld a decision. Remember, these are minutes. They upheld a decision by the Apostle John A. Woodstow of denying a temple recommend to a sister who had 1/32 of Negro blood in her veins. Only 1/32 of Negro blood in her veins. She couldn't get the temple recommend. This priesthood ban and temple ban, like I said, was done away with in 1978 by Spencer W. Kimball. Okay, jumping ahead to 1954, Prophet David O. McKay Diary, July 9th, 1954 entry. He says he considered a letter about issuing temple recommends to non-tithe payers. I explained that people who go to the temple should be full tithe payers and should observe the word of wisdom. So here, this has changed. They can't just show a willingness to pay tithing in the future or a willingness to keep the word of wisdom in the future. They have to keep it now. And they had to have kept it in the past to get the recommends here in 1954. All right, just some general advice from the Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith, Doctrines of Salvation, 1955. Young people should not go to the temple until they do have a testimony of the truth and a knowledge of the gospel. This wasn't in the temple recommend questions, but it's recommended by Joseph Fielding Smith. Later on, they would add items that you have to believe in, such as God and Jesus and the atonement. So you'd have to have a testimony of those things, but that comes later. All right. So in 1956, divorced people could not get a temple recommend unless approved by the First Presidency. So this information comes from Helps and Suggestions for Ward Bishoprics, 1956. Temple recommends will not be granted to the following persons: divorced persons who have not been given clearance by the First Presidency. Okay, same source here. Helps and Suggestions for Ward Bishoprics, 1956. Candidates should be full tithe payers or promise to become such. So that kind of conflicts with what David O. McKay was saying in his diary. All the way up here till 1956, you could still promise to pay your tithing and get into the temple. All right, same source here, 1956. A temple candidate should abstain from the use of tea, coffee, tobacco, and alcoholic drinks. If the church wanted to get more members, they should do away with the word of wisdom. We got, 40% of the world who drinks coffee almost every day. 80% of them drink tea. Less amounts of people use tobacco, but ton of people who drink wine and beer and other alcoholic beverages. I could see them changing this in the future at some point because it just limits who they can really convert and baptize. All right, going back to Edward L. Kimball's article, in 1957, the question asked about garments was whether applicants wore the regulation garments. Later, they would change the language to approved garments or authorized garments. All right, the 1960 Handbook of Instructions specified that a recommend for a divorced person required First Presidency clearance, and this would change over time. The rule became less stringent over time. The prophet at this time was David O. McKay. Okay, 1960 General Handbook of Instructions again. The 1960 Handbook specified that keeping the word of wisdom meant abstaining from tea, coffee, tobacco, and liquor. Liquor probably should have been more precise, saying, any alcoholic beverages like wine and beer. Pictured above, Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. I'm a big bourbon fan, and these are some of the ultimate and greatest bourbons you can get and find and drink, especially the George T. Stagg and the William LaRue Weller. Good luck finding these, though. They're oftentimes thousands of dollars. Okay, so sticking with the 1960 General Handbook of Instructions, candidates should have no affiliation in sympathy or otherwise with any of the apostate groups, like the fundamentalists who practice polygamy, FLDS, etc., that are running counter to the established order of the church. Okay, sticking with the 1960 General Handbook of Instructions, temple candidates should sustain local and general authorities of the church. That's still in there to this day. Pictured above, one of the more recent Quorum of the 12 photos. All right, sticking with the 1960 handbook, candidates should be full tithe payers or will covenant to become such. This question is still in there all the way up to 1960. You can still covenant to pay tithing in the future. So I guess this is how they got people to promise to do it. All right, 1963 General Handbook of Instruction. People who had been divorced more than once or who had been previously sealed in the temple, I guess married in the temple, for them to continue to get their temple recommend, they needed first presidency clearance. So these questions and clearance for divorced people continues to evolve. This is 1963. Prophet at the time is David O. McKay. Okay, sticking with the 1963 General Handbook of Instructions. It instructs the bishop in there to inquire whether the applicants for renewal of recommends are abiding by all conditions of their temple obligations, aka their temple covenants. So they need to be living by all their temple covenants. This language was omitted in 1968, but was included again in 1979. All right, some interesting information about casinos, such as in Las Vegas or in other states. This is a first presidency statement, I guess. The prophet was David O. McKay, counselors Hugh B. Brown and N. Eldon Tanner, along with Joseph Fielding Smith in this letter, I guess, to stake presidents in Las Vegas and Reno, Nevada, plus presidents of California missions, because I guess there's casinos in California. This letter dated August 30, 1966. Casino dealers, pit bosses, cashiers and tellers, windows, change girls, bartenders, cocktail waitresses, cigar and cigarette girls should not be issued temple recommends at all. Pretty crazy. I can't imagine this is still a policy in the church today. I don't think it's in the modern handbook. Okay, the prophet David O. McKay in his diary, April 26, 1967. A married sister residing in a ward who has been guilty of moral transgression resulting in pregnancies and abortions, leave her situation to the Lord, he says, and she should not be given a temple recommend. So that may be because of the moral transgressions, maybe because of the abortions as well. Nowadays, you can be forgiven of abortion and go to the temple. However, in the handbook, it says you can't go on a mission. So, all right. So the temple clearance for divorced persons continues to evolve. 1968 General Handbook of Instructions. The prophet, again, is David O. McKay. In 1968, only a sealed person had to be cleared by the First Presidency, while other divorced persons could obtain a recommend after careful interviews, inquiring especially about infidelity. So on the last slide we read, if they'd had more than one divorce, they had to get clearance. Now it's only people that have been divorced who were sealed in the temple that need to be cleared by the First Presidency. And then I think they pushed that down to local leaders, and then it continues to evolve. All right, another change in the 1968 General Handbook of Instructions. The 1968 handbook referred to alcoholic beverages being part of the Word of Wisdom rather than liquor as in the 1960 handbook, probably so that they could include beer and wine. So it's more specific. Okay, an interview with William H. Stoddard, which was found in Sunstone, 1985. But they're referring back to a 1969 First Presidency letter which announced that it was not appropriate for those involved firsthand with liquor, such as bartenders or cocktail waitresses, to receive temple recommends. So presumably this is outside of casinos now. Bartenders and cocktail waitresses could not receive temple recommends. I highly doubt that's still the case today. Okay, same interview here with William Stoddard. This 1969 First Presidency letter also indicated that persons involved firsthand in gambling as dealers in Las Vegas should not normally receive a temple recommend. So those involved firsthand with gambling, such as dealers, couldn't get their recommends. All right, what about conscientious objectors in regards to the armed forces? This comes from D. Michael Quinn's book, The Mormon Hierarchy, Extensions of Power. On October 21st, 1971, the First Presidency Secretary Joseph Anderson writes that conscientious objectors can receive temple recommends. Oh, woo. All right, so the first time that drugs are mentioned here is in 1971, I guess illegal drugs. First Presidency letter, February 12th, 1971. A searching interview should be conducted by the bishop and also by the stake president to determine whether or not they keep the word of wisdom or use drugs. So presumably marijuana would disqualify you, and any other illegal drugs, although marijuana is now becoming legal in a lot of states. Okay, same letter here. First Presidency letter, February 12th, 1971, referring to homosexuality in this one. A searching interview should be conducted by the bishop and also by the stake president to determine whether or not he is morally clean, or she, I guess, free from adultery, fornication, and homosexuality. So, in 1971, just being a homosexual, I guess, would not allow you to get a temple recommend. Okay, some information in Maxine Hanks' book, Women and Authority, Re-Emerging Mormon Feminism, 1992. Referring back to the 1970s, there was a woman named Lonetta Murphy. She was actively engaged in the ERA movement, Equal Rights Amendment, I guess, for women, equal rights for women. Lonetta says that this strong defense of the ERA has put me into some very awkward positions in the church. My temple recommend was voided because of my ERA position. So once you start gathering information outside of these handbooks, there's a lot of other reasons that bishops can use in actual practice to bar you from the temple. All right, 1976 General Handbook of Instructions. Prophet at this time is Spencer W. Kimball. So starting in 1976, temple candidates are asked whether they wear their garments night and day. So presumably they've gone through the temple before. They got their garments. Now they are required to wear them night and day to continue with their temple recommends. About the only times you're allowed to not wear them would be swimming or maybe exercising. Some bishops are even strict about exercise. All right, staying on the 1976 General Handbook of Instructions. In this handbook, the question about divorce expanded to ask, what was the real reason for the divorce? They're so nosy, right? I think they want to know about infidelity or cheating, because that'll also bar you from the temple. The First Presidency clearance was not required in the case of a sealed person whose divorce was caused by the infidelity of the partner. So this continues to evolve, divorce and getting back into the temple. Prophet still Spencer W. Kimball at this time. Okay, 1976 General Handbook or Supplement. There were some supplements in this year. Temple candidates were asked whether any transgression relating to the law of chastity should have been confessed but was not. So they ask you, are you living the law of chastity? But then if you say no, or you have some questions, then they drill down. And on other slides, we're going to get into some of those questions they might drill down on and some of the specifics of what living the law of chastity looks like and still getting into the temple. Okay, July 1st, 1976, General Handbook Supplement. Temple candidates must believe that the church president is a prophet, seer, and revelator, and the only person on the earth authorized to exercise all priesthood keys. Very similar language still in the temple recommend questions today. Okay, 1976 General Handbook or Supplement. Honesty was not made an explicit question until the 1976 Handbook, which asked, are you honest in your dealings with your fellow men? It's a little more lenient today in the handbook or in the questions. They ask, do you strive to be honest? But I guess before 1976, being honest wasn't as important. Okay, 1976 General Handbook. Will you earnestly strive to do your duty in the church, to attend your sacrament, priesthood, and other meetings, and to obey the rules, laws, and commandments of the gospel? Similar language still in there today. All right, same handbook, 1976. Bishops were to conduct especially searching interviews with the children of apostates to assure their orthodoxy. Church very concerned about apostates, people like me, right? So if my kid wanted to get into the temple, he'd have to go through an especially searching interview. Okay, same handbook in 1976. Bishops were reminded that long hair on men or tattoos were not by themselves reasons to deny a recommend unless they were so extreme as to be unbecoming in the house of the Lord. So you could have really long hair, I guess, like a metalhead, and maybe not get in if it was extreme enough. What about extreme tattoos, like such as the guy pictured above? If you get tattoos on your face, is that so extreme that you can't get a recommend? Okay, some information about vasectomies. We'll go over this meme pictured here above first. The church has its own insurance called DMBA. It's for LDS church employees. This insurance has a policy on vasectomies and tubal ligations. Tubal ligation or vasectomy are not covered for family planning under the church's insurance, but will be covered when medical conditions of the wife justify the procedure based on one or more of the following criteria being met. If she's maternal age of 40 or greater, then she could have a tubal ligation, or the husband could get a vasectomy. Or the woman has had 5 pregnancies or live births, then you can get a tubal ligation or vasectomy. The church is so controlling. That's because vasectomy and tubal ligation is strongly discouraged in the handbooks. They don't tell you this, but this is their policy, I think, even today. The Apostle Bruce R. McConkie made a comment in a solemn assembly January 10th, 1976. Regarding vasectomy, McConkie says, "We deplore this act. Temple recommends could be withheld if you have a vasectomy. There must be true repentance." So you guys just see the church is just a bunch of control freaks. All right, some information from an anonymous person in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, autumn 1976. He says the written temple interview has new questions, specifically about masturbation and homosexuality. I don't know what those are. I wasn't able to find them. It wasn't in Kimball's article. Edward Kimball. So I don't know if this is for sure true or not, but it sounds like something the church would do. And when they ask you about the law of chastity, they can drill down in these areas if they want to, asking, do you masturbate? Are you homosexual? And if so, can't go to the temple. The meme above is a quote from Spencer W. Kimball. It's a warning to not touch yourself. Don't touch your peen, it says. So Kimball says, what is more, it too often leads to grievous sin. That's masturbation. Even to that sin against nature, homosexuality. Masturbation leads to homosexuality. Not true. For done in private, it evolves often into mutual masturbation, practiced with another person of the same sex, and thence into total homosexuality. All right. In 1978, African Americans finally became eligible to receive their temple ordinances because for the preceding 130 years or so, African Americans could not have the priesthood. The males could not have the priesthood, and the males and the females could not go to the temple and could not be sealed to their families and their kids. So that's a big a big ban here. The African Americans didn't even need to be interviewed with these temple recommend questions because they were automatically not worthy. Okay, March 1st, 1978, General Handbook Supplement. A person who had not repented of impure, unholy, or unnatural sex acts could not receive a recommend. All right, what do they mean by unnatural? Well, if you talk to your bishop about it, he's probably going to say that that's homosexuality, homosexual relationships, oral sex, or anal sex here around this time frame, 1978. So if you're doing any of those, maybe even with your wife, you're not going to get into the temple. Okay, a statement from the apostle and in the first presidency, N. Eldon Tanner, pictured above, in General Conference, October 1978. It is important to refrain from the use of drugs, swearing, telling dirty stories, homosexuality, and other evil and immoral practices which deprive us of such important blessings as going to the temple. All right, illegal drugs, I think that's still in common practice. Swearing, no, that's not in the handbook anymore, if it ever was. Telling dirty stories, no. Homosexuality, yeah, if you drill down on the law of chastity. All these things are evil and immoral and can keep you from going to the temple, I guess, here in 1978, especially if you're being interviewed by N. Eldon Tanner. But he's given this this information in a general conference talk, so it's semi-official. Okay, another story about a woman who supported the ERA and lost her temple recommend because of it. This can be found in an article by Amy L. Bentley in Dialogue, A Journal of Mormon Thought, fall 1990. Referring back to a case in 1980, a person told of being given a temple recommend and then having it revoked because of her support of the ERA. Equal Rights Amendment for Women. This is the way they try to control their members. They don't like their political activity, so now you can't go to the temple. Okay, the prophet Spencer W. Kimball, strongly against masturbation and homosexuality, gives us a speech on morality, which showed up in the Ensign. I presume it was in General Conference. Ensign, November 1980. Kimball says, anyone fettered by this weakness of masturbation should abandon the habit before he goes on a mission or receives the holy priesthood or goes in the temple for his blessings. So if you're masturbating, you got to give it up before you can go to the temple here, according to the prophet Kimball in 1980. Okay, First Presidency Letter, January 5th, 1982 now. Spencer W. Kimball, still the prophet. And he's talking about married persons. They should understand that if their marital relations are guilty of unnatural, impure, or unholy practices, they should not enter the temple. What are these unnatural things? Well, we've kind of talked about them. Homosexuality, oral sex, anal sex, but he's going to get more specific on the next slide. All right, so if married couples have participated in any of these kinds of acts, they must repent and discontinue any of these practices in order to go to the temple. The First Presidency has interpreted oral sex as constituting an unnatural, impure, or unholy practice. There it is. One of those unnatural things, oral sex, and this is for married couples. Married couples could not go through the temple. The bishops start asking this question: Are you having oral sex? Got to take your temple recommend. What do you think was the backlash in the church? Well, we'll go over it on the next slide. All right, so about 9 months later, on October 15, 1982, the First Presidency sent a letter rescinding the ban on oral sex, stating that bishops should never inquire into personal, intimate matters involving marital relations between a man and his wife. And there's that the letter pictured above, if you can see it. It's small. It's on church letterhead, October 15, 1982, to all stake, mission, and district presidencies, bishops, and branch presidents. Dear brethren, blah, 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 blah. Signed by Spencer W. Kimball and his counselors, the First Presidency. We've had a lot of people say they're really enjoying this oral sex stuff. They can't get their temple recommends. So, yeah, we're going to rescind it. So this inspiration or revelation, whatever, is done away with around 9 months later. All right, more evolution of the divorced question. This is 1983 General Handbook of Instructions. Spencer Kimball, the prophet at the time. So in 1983, the First Presidency clearance was no longer required for any divorced person to obtain a recommend, although the stake president was admonished to be especially thorough in the interview. What was the reasons for your prior divorce? Was there any adultery going on? So yeah, First Presidency probably couldn't keep up with this, so they, pushed things down to the local level. All right, an interesting factoid here in the 1983 General Handbook of Instructions. It encourages married couples to have families. Doesn't say that that's tied to a temple recommend. But yeah, they want you to provide as many bodies for those spirits waiting in the pre-existence, right? That's the purpose of life, to populate the planet. This advice was reiterated in the 1985 and 1989 handbooks. Not sure what happened after that. All right, still on the 1983 handbook. Persons who have had transsexual operations might be baptized if otherwise worthy, but could not receive a temple recommend. So if you had a transsexual operation, couldn't go to the temple in 1983. The policy was also in the 1985 handbook, but taken out in the 1989 handbook, but it's probably still church policy today. Okay, in the 1983 handbook, it instructs bishops that a member who refuses to pay federal or state income taxes is in direct conflict with the teachings of the church, they're breaking the law, and may be ineligible for a temple recommend. So you don't pay your taxes, maybe you can't get into the temple. This statement was also in the 1985 and 1989 handbooks, I guess taken out after that. All right, so starting in 1985, the handbook added questions that dealt expressly with belief. So you had to believe in certain things. Do you believe in God, the Eternal Father, in His Son, Jesus Christ, and in the atonement, those kinds of things. This is again from Edward L. Kimball's article in the Journal of Mormon History in 1998. Okay, staying on the 1985 handbook. Prophet at the time was Ezra Taft Benson. At least he was in November 1985. Not sure when this handbook came out. It probably was slightly before him. His counselors were N. Eldon Tanner and Gordon B. Hinckley. Members should have faith in God the Eternal Father, in His Son Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Ghost, which I kind of mentioned already. Okay, same 1985 handbook. Temple candidates should have a firm testimony of the restored gospel. A firm testimony. That's kind of hard to do, especially for a lot of progressives, right? A firm testimony, well, I hope it's true, right? What a lot of progressives say. Prophet still probably Benson. The word firm was taken out in 1996. So it just says candidates should have a testimony in 1996, not a firm testimony. All right, sticking with the 1985 handbook, in there it asks the direct question of, do you live the law of chastity? So I guess that's the first time it was the direct question. And then you can say no, or what does that mean? You know, I was making out with my girlfriend and we were laying on top of each other. Did I break the law of chastity? And then the bishop will tell you it's kind of bishop roulette, depending on his opinions. You know, whether you broke the law of chastity and hence cannot go to the temple. All right, another question added in 1985 regarding child support. So for those who are divorced or legally separated, the question was added, are you presently fulfilling your obligations for support and maintenance of your family? All right, so what does it mean to live the law of chastity? Well, we have a First Presidency policy statement. Prophet was Ezra Taft Benson at this time. It can be found in the March 1989 General Handbook of Instructions. You know, so bishops or stake presidents could use this to say, hey, you're not living the law of chastity. To be morally clean or living the law of chastity, a person must refrain from adultery and fornication, from homosexual or lesbian relations, and from every other unholy, unnatural, or impure practice, which we've gone over. Okay, same March 1989 handbook. Church members who abuse their family, either physically, emotionally, or sexually, should not receive a temple recommend. All right, another source here from Lavina Fielding Anderson in Dialogue, spring of 1993. Talking about a man named Ross Peterson, and this occurred around February 1990. I guess he was the editor of Dialogue. He had his LDS temple recommend revoked for responding favorably to a reporter who asked about changes in the LDS temple ceremonies. So I'm not sure what happened here. Maybe he revealed something about the temple ceremonies that the church didn't like. Okay, a statement from the apostle and in the First Presidency, Gordon B. Hinckley. Ensign Magazine, May 1990. So this may have occurred in General Conference. He says you have to obey the law of the land in order to get your temple recommend. That's not in there anymore. It says you have to obey the law of the gospel now. But he says obedience to law, when constitutional, is incumbent on the Latter-day Saints and therefore becomes a standard of eligibility to enter the temples of the church. All right, the church doesn't like intellectuals, and they can actually take your temple recommend away if you are talking about or publishing things critical of the church. This can be found in the diaries of Leonard Arrington, Volume 3, and he's talking about a time on October 5th, 1990. The church begins disciplining employees at BYU who have participated in the annual Sunstone Symposium, Some professors have their temple recommends revoked for this. And Boyd K. Packer was kind of an anti-intellectual guy. He says there is a temptation for the writer or the teacher of church history to want to tell everything, whether it is worthy or faith-promoting or not. Some things that are true are not very useful. Okay, another statement about child support, 1991 supplement to the 1989 General Handbook of Instructions. In 1991, candidates were asked the following: are you current with obligations or child support specified by court order or in other written binding commitments? All right, a little bit more bishop roulette here. These are the kinds of things that happen in actual practice, with certain bishops. These aren't going to be in the Temple Recommend questions, but the source for this is J. Bonner Ritchie, article in Sunstone, August 1992. He says, I know a woman who went jogging in shorts and was told by her bishop that she was violating her temple covenants. Well, how so? She argued and won by every point of logic, but her bishop still would not give her a temple recommend because she removed her garments to go jogging. That's pretty strict. Probably most bishops would not do this, but some do. Saying you have to wear your garments when you're exercising. Okay, another example of a LDS intellectual having their temple recommend removed. This is from Levi S. Peterson in Dialogue, winter of 1996. Referring back to a time in May of 1993 when the Mormon scholar Lavina Fielding Anderson had an interview with her stake president. The discipline envisioned by the stake president, should Lavina continue to uphold her dialogue article and maintain her activities with the Mormon Alliance, probably, saying things critical of the church. The discipline envisioned, if she would continue to uphold these things, was that she should surrender her temple recommend. And then I guess she refused. So shortly after this, Lavina was excommunicated for apostasy, I believe, as part of the September 6. Okay, another weird example, and this one was for the entire ward. Reba L. Keel, an article in Sunstone, November 1993. Reba says, I was in a ward where you could not have a temple recommend unless your 7-generation genealogical records were complete. All right, another weird example of a stake president in actual practice here. This is from Paul Toscano in a book, I think, The Sanctity of Dissent, 1994. He says, also disturbing is the story of the stake president who, to the standard requirements for a church position or a temple recommend, added the requirement of a clean-shaven face for men and bras for women. So if you had a beard and mustache, I guess you couldn't go to the temple if you were being interviewed by this stake president. And if you weren't wearing a bra, he wouldn't let you go to the temple either. All right, another example in Dialogue, spring of 1998, letter to the editor. One Mormon man lost his temple recommend due to living platonically with a member of the opposite sex. So they weren't even doing anything, weren't even having sex or breaking the law of chastity, just living together platonically, and he couldn't get his temple recommend. So what is platonically? It's without desire, without lust, affectionately, sexlessly, and amicably. But this guy couldn't get his temple recommend for that. All right, another example of an intellectual having his temple recommend removed and then actually being excommunicated is D. Michael Quinn. He's another one of the September 6. A lot of sources for this, but the one I used is from the Ostlings, Mormon America, 1999. D. Michael Quinn, whose research into post-manifesto polygamy and other sensitive areas of LDS history, which led to his eventual resignation from a tenured professorship at BYU, loss of his temple recommend, and finally his church membership excommunicated. One of the best Mormon historians, I think, in my opinion. There's a new book out about him that just came out, 2022. Signature Books, D. Michael Quinn, Mormon Historian by Gary Topping. Short book on his life. All right, 1996 General Handbook of Instructions, saying that you need to have a testimony of certain things. Do you have faith in and a testimony of the members of the Godhead? Do you have a testimony of the atonement of Christ? Okay, also 1996 Handbook. In 1996, the criteria go beyond the earlier language of sustaining the other general authorities to an express acknowledgement that members of the Quorum of the 12 are prophets, seers, and revelators. All right, 1996 Handbook again emphasizes that wearing the garment night and day is in accordance with the covenant that you made in the temple. Interesting to note that on all of the garments for men and women there are Masonic symbols. Right breast has the square, left breast has the compass. And there's also a mark on the belly button, which I don't think is a Masonic symbol, but I could be wrong about that. Okay, Church Handbook of Instructions, Book 1, 1998. A member who has undergone an elective transsexual operation may not receive a temple recommend. Okay, a first worldwide leadership training meeting. Found the manual for this. This is a statement from the Apostle Henry B. Eyring, January 11, 2003. Those who enter the house of the Lord should be free from any unclean, unholy, impure, or unnatural practice. Unnatural could be homosexual activity, oral sex, or anal sex. All right. Apostle Henry B. Eyring again here. Same source, 2003. In regards to the law of chastity for unmarried applicants, you might use the statement in the booklet for the strength of youth in your temple interviews. So when you're going to drill down on the law of chastity, what does the law of chastity mean? Well, Henry B. Eyring tells us you can look to the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet to know what the law of chastity is. And so these are the kind of questions that bishops and stake presidents will further drill down on that a lot of people don't know about unless you go through this. But the 2001 version of the For the Strength of Youth booklet or pamphlet, a year or two before this statement says, and Eyring says you should look at this to understand what the law of chastity is. But in that pamphlet it says, do not participate in passionate kissing. So that could keep you out of the temple. Do not lie on top of another person. That could keep you out. Do not touch the private sacred parts of another person's body, aka genitals, Eyring. You can use proper language here. Do not touch their genitals with or without clothing. Also, homosexual activity is a serious sin, and pornography in all of its forms is especially dangerous and addictive. All these things could potentially keep you out of the temple, especially for unmarried applicants. All right. According to the Apostle Dallin H. Oakes, looking at pornography can keep you out of the temple. April 2005. I would guess that most men in the church look at pornography and masturbate, even married ones. Oakes says some have suggested that pornography should be a separate question in the Temple Recommend interview. He says it is already. No, it's not a separate question, but there's other ones that address it according to Oakes. At least 5 different questions should elicit a confession and discussion on this subject. So porn and masturbation can keep you out, depending on your bishop. All right, the LDS Family Services Addiction Recovery Program. A Guide to Addiction Recovery and Healing, June 2nd, 2005. See the cover pictured above. Some of the addictions that they work on in this program are drugs. Yeah, you can certainly become addicted to drugs. Gambling, yeah, probably can get addicted to that. And pornography. I don't think that's really a thing. Being addicted to porn and masturbation. I think that's just pretty normal. But all these things, Mormon men, married, unmarried, have to go, or sometimes their bishops recommend that they go to these addiction recovery programs. And these addictions keep them out of the temple. Because in this book, what is this, manual, it says, although you may not have thought it possible before, you can now imagine entering the doors of the Holy Temple once you get these addictions under control, right? All right, another source here, John D. Gustav Rathall, The Tug of War in Sunstone, November 2005. John says, I had already been disciplined, that is, denied callings, denied a temple recommend, and could not take the sacrament for admitting to my bishop that I had masturbated. See, so there's an example of it that'll keep you out. A famous talk by Boyd K. Packer on masturbation was published in a pamphlet, an address given in 1976. Apostle Boyd K. Packer, 2 Young Men Only, where I believe he talks about the little factory. And you'll either know what that is or you won't, or you can look it up. Okay, so if you're for same-sex marriage, politically active in regards to this, you can also have your temple recommends withdrawn. This was a story that showed up in the Salt Lake Tribune in 2014 by Peggy Fletcher Stack. Can Mormons back same-sex marriage and still get into the temple? Referring back to a time in February of 2008, where some Mormons disagreed with Prop 8, which was a California ballot proposition intended to ban same-sex marriage. These Mormons reported having their temple recommends withdrawn, but that was not church policy according to General Authority L. Whitney Clayton of the Quorum of the 70, but it did go on. The Mormon Church likes to control its members and what they're involved in politically. Okay, 2010 General Handbook. Those who have been excommunicated must wait at least 5 years before they can get another temple recommend. Pictured above all these kinds of different people that have been excommunicated. Sam Young, Kate Kelly, D. Michael Quinn, Levina Fielding Anderson, Paul Toscano, John DeLynn, Bill Reel, Natasha Helfer, and some others on here. If they want to get back in, I guess they have to wait 5 years. Okay, Handbook 2, Administering the Church 2010. Members who experience same-sex attraction but do not engage in homosexual behavior may receive church callings and temple recommends. So you can be gay, you just can't act on it. You can't ever get married. You can't ever have sex, unfortunately. But I guess you can be gay now in 2010 if you don't engage in the behaviors and still get your temple recommend. But of course, this is not universal, and it depends on your bishop and your stake president and how homophobic they are. This is from Seth Bracken, Living Gay in the Mormon Church, an article in the Q Salt Lake Magazine, 2011. Just shortly after this handbook. But apparently, One gay man described how his stake president denied his temple recommend simply because of his friendship with other gay men. No homosexual behavior, just friendship, and his involvement in a charity bingo for the Utah Pride. Stake president took his recommend for that. All right, another example of this. In 2013, a gay man stripped of his temple recommend just for being gay, not even from gay behavior. So this is from, it's in Gregory A. Prince's book, Gay Rights and the Mormon Church, 2018. After receiving a prompting from the Spirit to tell my bishop that I was gay, not a good idea, I was stripped of my mission call, my temple recommend, and I was set to enter the temple to receive my endowment only 3 days later, and I was physically removed from the building. Really homophobic bishop there. He says, I'm gay. Doesn't say he did any gay behavior. Stripped of his mission call and his temple recommend. Okay, statement from the Apostle L. Tom Perry, Priesthood Leadership Conference, February 15, 2014. Basically saying that those who support same-sex marriage are going against the teachings of the prophet. And we are to ask these people questions so that they will incriminate themselves and then not be able to get a temple recommend, basically, for supporting same-sex marriage. So the question was asked to him, how do you handle, it's asked to L. Tom Perry, how do you handle a temple recommend interview with individuals that are against the teachings of the prophet, such as same-sex marriage? Perry answers, ask them questions, and if necessary, they will incriminate themselves. Put the burden on them. And, you know, that's still in the questions now, right? Do you support the teachings, or do you support the modern-day prophet? All right. You can have your temple recommend withdrawn simply for supporting the ordained women movement, getting women the priesthood in the church. Some of these people that were involved in that, their bishops tried to get them out of it and tried to control them by taking away their temple recommends. There's an example of this that shows up in the Salt Lake Tribune, July 4th, 2014, written by Peggy Fletcher Stack. Article entitled, Fear Runs Through Many Mormons in the Ordained Women Ranks. The Ordained Women founder, Kate Kelly, was excommunicated for conduct contrary to the laws and order of the church. Kate Kelly says that her parents, who live in Provo, had their temple recommends withdrawn for supporting their daughter. They weren't even actively involved in the movement, I guess, just supporting their daughter, who is the founder of it. And they had their temple recommends withdrawn. Okay, a very similar case in 2015. This is from the Associated Press. Article entitled, LDS Women's Group Board Member Says that she is forced to resign. April Young Bennett, pictured above, of South Jordan, Utah, says that her stake president told her that she would have to leave the ordained women's board if she wanted to keep her so-called temple recommend. All right, statement from the church spokesman Eric Hawkins, Salt Lake Tribune, April 2015. Hawkins, pictured above. The church does not ordain transgender people to the priesthood or issue temple recommends to them. All right, a comment on Reddit. A new stake policy about chastity and temple attendance. 2017. So this was a policy for young single adults in a stake. These members must wait 4 months before they can go to the temple if they masturbate, look at porn, or engage in heavy petting. They must wait 4 months to go to the temple. No masturbation, no porn, no heavy petting. All right. What about breastfeeding your 18-month-old child at church without a cover? So your breast is basically out. You know, the young teenage boys walking by. David Noyce wrote this article this week in Mormon Land, the Salt Lake Tribune, 2018. A northern Utah mother has been denied a temple recommend because of her sin. What was her sin? Breastfeeding her 18-month-old child in the foyer of the Mormon meeting house without a cover. So I guess being immodest. This was pretty controversial. Okay, the 2019 temple recommend question. It's actually about your thoughts. And I don't think I saw this before 2019. Do you strive for moral cleanliness in your thoughts and behavior? So that's kind of interesting. Potentially, you couldn't get a recommend if you're not trying to control your dirty thoughts, maybe your sexual thoughts. Do you strive for moral cleanliness in your thoughts and behavior? All right, another one of our LGBTQ brethren, a man, I guess a man, Grayson, who was a transgender person. The church did not permit Grayson to serve a mission, when he came of age, and he has never held a temple recommend. Grayson says, I have been temple recommend worthy this whole time. So no homosexual behavior here, right? Or transgender behavior. Well, with another person. I have been temple recommend worthy this whole time, but I don't fit in the gender boxes, so I cannot go, he says. Can't go on his mission and can't get a temple recommend. This showed up in Jana Reese's book, The Next Mormons 2019. Grayson is transgender but has not had surgery to change his sexual organs or physical appearance. He does dress like a man and uses hormones and testosterone. So I guess in his case he can't go to the temple. All right, another example. A woman named Blair had her temple recommend removed because of her outspokenness on women's ordination, ordained women movement, and her outspokenness on LGBT rights. This was also in Jana Reese's book, The Next Mormons, 2019. Blair was a primary president in her local ward, but she now has no calling, and several years ago, her temple recommend became a casualty because of her outspokenness on women's ordination and LGBT rights. All right, a little bit more information on this. Her bishop, or the bishop, told Blair that she could either stop speaking about controversial issues or have a disciplinary council about her temple recommend. She chose to surrender her temple recommend. Okay, a BYU dissertation, Adam M. Scalesi, not sure how you say that. Understanding the processes and outcomes of the LDS Addiction Recovery Program and dealing with porn. This is 2019. I did not like the focus on relapse, from looking at porn. I have experienced so much stress that has happened because I have focused on not relapsing in order to get a temple recommend. So again, in 2019, looking at porn can't get a recommend. That's when they drill down, on the law of chastity questions. All right, not being able to get a temple recommend because you were sexually abused. Amazing here. Shocking. A University of Utah dissertation by Amber C. Whiteley, The Healing Processes of Childhood Sexual Abuse Survivors Within the LDS Church, 2019. Woman named Brittany described an impactful experience with her bishop that she met with as a college student at BYU, who suggested that her feelings of guilt meant that she needed to repent for her sexual abuse. Okay, her story continues. Same source here. The bishop said, like if you're feeling that way, in other words, feeling guilt, that means that you have work to do. So I can't give you a temple recommend, and it's going to take a very, very long time for you to be forgiven. For sexual abuse committed by another person. This is shocking, but it actually happens to a lot of women in the church. I did a Facebook post about this, and a lot of these progressive Mormons, post-Mormons, said that this happened to them in the comments. All right, so I've kind of compared and contrasted a lot of these statements to the 2019 Temple Recommend questions, which you can find online. Just search for Temple Recommend questions, or you can look at this specific website in the newsroom, churchofjesuschrist.org. You can see all of the modern day Temple Recommend questions. They changed them in 2019. It's now 2022. But that's going to do it for this video. We went about 1 hour and 45 minutes, so kind of a medium length, not too short, not too long, compared to some of the ones I do that are 4 hours. But I thank you for watching the Changes in Temple Recommend Questions 1856 to 2022 video.